Okay, great. Welcome everybody to our February 2024 Skill Summit. We are going to be focusing today on grassroots organizing, and it's such a broad topic. There's so many different ways that we could go, but what I want to highlight today is a particular article that I'll go ahead and put into the chats for those of us who are participating online. It's an article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review that I came across through a friend of mine many years ago. And I've really thought about it a lot, and I found it to be super helpful. It's covering the topic, should you agitate, innovate, or orchestrate? And this is a framework that we can use to understand the role that we want to play and should play or are most suited to play in a movement for social change. Um, there's lots of different subgroups within the LGBTQ community, each of which has, potentially unique goals or points of advocacy. And so finding our lane is probably the most important thing that we can do as leaders and change agents to make the most of our talents, the most of our skills, and yeah, so, the Pride Network, just a little bit about us in case this is your first time uh, in a sharing space with us. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the mission of training and empowering heart-centered emerging leaders across the country. We have an amazing national network of leaders who participate in our year-long transformational leadership initiative, applications for which are actually currently live. So if you're between the ages of 20 and 30 and you want to experience our year-long leadership training, we have one of our cohort members in this space today, so I'm sure they could tell you about it if you have any questions from their perspective. And we also offer $2,000 of social impact funding. So everybody comes into our programs with some kind of a project that they're working on, and we value the financial support aspect of what it means to empower young leaders. And then we're also offering opportunities like this, where we're creating spaces to talk about professional skill development. And soon we're going to be launching a new program, which I'm really excited about. And that'll be more of a futuristic experience of mentorship. So stay tuned for all of that. If you're not on our email list, it would be great to stay in touch about these things. Um, and I'm also happy to answer any questions in the chat throughout this webinar if they come up. So yeah, without further ado, I think we should begin. So talking about agitation, innovation, and orchestration. These are really primary categories that we can, I don't want to say identify with, but we can see ourselves in them. So agitators, for example, are really working to um, stir the pot a little bit. Um, an example of someone like that might be Marsha P. Johnson, who was one of the fundamental activists back in the 20th century who helped get this movement started. Martin Luther King Jr. said that an agitator in a washing machine is this thing that helps kind of stir the clothing around. And without that, the clothes really wouldn't get clean. So there's this aspect of social change and grassroots organizing where we want to think this through that lens, where we can stir the pot, get things moving. Maybe the status quo isn't working in the way that we need it to, um, and so we can lean into that. An agitator's goal, thus, is to articulate a critique and mobilize diverse parties around that. So, what they need to do is they need to be able to highlight a problem that exists and needs to be solved. How we communicate that depends on our relationship to our communities. So, if we are someone who's directly affected by that particular problem, One of the more powerful avenues that we have to our advantage is storytelling. So being able to come up with your own personal narrative helps drive what in persuasive communication we call um, ethos. It is your authority. What authority do you have as an activist to speak on this subject? If it's coming from personal experience, then that's a pretty good source of authority. If you're speaking on behalf of a group or on behalf of other people, you're acting more like a spokesperson. And that also has some weight to it, depending on how many people are engaged in the work that you're trying to move forward or to bring to the surface or highlight. um, Building that grassroots network is going to be sort of a first order of business. Aligning ourselves with people who share the same values, who have the same ideas about how we can create change, and then growing our movement from that kind of a space. So, how we communicate that problem also relates to how we are organizing. So, agitators are people who launch collective action against the status quo. So, again, what is the problem? Identifying the problem is always the most important piece of the equation, because if you don't know the problem you're trying to solve, then the answers that you're coming up with might not really be what's most impactful or what's most needed. So when we're launching a collective action, we need to be clear about what it is we're organizing around. We need to be able to clearly articulate the problem. Next, evaluating success as an agitator really means assessing the extent to which agitation resonates with movement participants and establishes a common purpose. It's kind of an academic sentence, so let's break it down a little bit. Assess the extent to which agitation resonates. So we need to be able to gauge how effective our communication is with the demographics that we're trying to reach. Establishing some kind of a feedback mechanism is really important. Um, these are also opportunities for you to be jotting down notes and making any questions or formulating questions that might be arising at this point, like, oh, how do I measure my impact? How do I create some sort of an assessment that can gauge the effectiveness of my communication? But the second piece of this, for agitators especially, is how do we assess our communication in ways that establish a common purpose? So, not just does this raise awareness? It means, does this raise awareness and bring people together? So, it's one of those things that takes some finesse. Just kind of like shouting at the sky and saying, oh, there's all these problems, oh, they're so terrible, might not really be an effective way to bring people together under a common purpose. When we know what the problem is, we can start to identify the main points. Like if you have a river, like the Mississippi River, there's different cities that lie along the coast or the borders of that river. You've got cities like St. Louis or New Orleans, Minneapolis. Each of those points represents a junction. So when we've identified our problem, what are these different junctions that we can bring people together on? Um, a good example of this might be what we're doing here at the Pride Network. So one of the things that we've pointed out in the status quo, and I'll speak from my own experience and how I've been seeing things, is that there is an epidemic of shame that's going on within the LGBTQ community. LGBTQ people are much more likely to experience shame compared to their straight peers, and that can lead to a whole lot of problems. So let's say shame is kind of the big category. This is like the issue and the status quo thing that we're trying to raise awareness around, we're trying to bring people together on. We're trying to highlight this problem that needs to be solved. How do we decrease shame in the LGBTQ community? And what are the consequences of not acting on that? Well, from our perspective, we say shame leads to burnout. We may feel like we're not good enough, or that we don't deserve good things, or that we have to overextend ourselves constantly in order to be worthy of love or worthy of acceptance. And so we may put ourselves in situations that lead to chronic burnout, that may lead to um, our inability to follow through as effective leaders over a longer period of time. So that's one issue. And that might resonate with a lot of people. Wow, yeah, I feel really burnt out. I'm constantly exhausted. The emotional labor that I'm giving to my cause is really just wiping me out. So that might be one junction point along a longer or bigger topic that we're trying to address. So figuring out what those different points look like. Another one might be um, fracturing within the LGBTQ community. Maybe people are really, really doubling down on the oppression and experiences that they've had. And this creates this kind of like oppression Olympics dynamic, which can be really divisive and doesn't really invite collaboration or empathy. And um, it can lead to these like fractures that make our movement weaker overall because we're not really united behind a common purpose. We can get too boxed in based off of our identity structures rather than seeing ourselves as connected to a broader whole. And that's another point that might resonate with people, where we want to be able to collaborate more effectively, share resources more effectively, just reduce the overall amount of division within our community and in our society, show a united front against the people who really, um, who really hate, who really hate us. So, um, and that actually is a nice segue into the last piece here that I want to talk about with agitators, which is the trap. The trap of agitation is fragmented agitation and stalled solutions. So just shouting at the sky or agitating in ways that are actually just going to start pushing people away or creating in groups and out groups, that prolongs the amount of time it takes to reach a common solution. It prolongs the vision that we all want to see with respect to what it is that we've identified as the problem. We say, oh, this is the problem, but we're not talking about it in a way that establishes common purpose. Then we're falling into the potential trap there. All right. So that's agitation. Any questions about that so far? You can also refer along with me to the chart that's in this article if you're joining us online. And let's see if we missed anything for agitation. I want to make sure I'm doing this thoroughness. Yeah, we have agitators have to be forward-looking and not accept short-term gains at the expense of long-term polarization. That's a super important point. Movements that criticize without offering ideas about how to address the problems at hand constructively can become sterile and even counterproductive over time. This is super good info. So, does anybody have any questions about agitation before we go on? We're also going to have a Q&A period opening up about 15 minutes before we close. So we can also save questions until then too, but feel free to chime in. This can be a discussion. So we have agitation. Let's talk about innovation. Innovation, I think, is probably what we're trying to do here most at the Pride Network. We are doing some agitation and we are doing some orchestration, but really what we're trying to do is develop an actionable solution and demonstrate its superiority to the status quo. So the big thing that we've leaned into here at the Pride Network, we're calling heart-centered leadership. And it's a very practical approach, but it also tackles some bigger, let's say almost philosophical issues that we need to unite around in terms of a value system if we're going to move forward and create what we're calling the beloved community, which is based off of teachings from Martin Luther King Jr. and the broader civil rights movement, Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So innovators are people who are actively trying to think about solutions. So identifying the problem and mobilizing around it is important. But if it doesn't come with a solution, then it's just shouting at the sky. So how do we innovate? And how do we tell people about why the approach that we're thinking about is superior or is going to be helpful? That comes from our communication, being able to connect the innovation that we're thinking about and working toward to the problem and explaining why it's a superior solution. That communication piece it can be challenging at times. And it's also related to the evaluation process. I mean, if we're not able to communicate the effectiveness of something, it's hard to sell people on it. They might say, "Oh, well, that sounds nice in theory, but it might just be idealistic and not really work." So, taking the time as we're getting started in our grassroots movements and communities and working on projects in our communities, taking the time to do the thing, collect data, evaluate it, analyze it, and present it in ways that are easily communicated to stakeholders is super, super fundamental and important and crucial. Innovators, when it comes to organizing, are really trying to build a coalition of supporters around the proposed solution. So the people that we're trying to reach need to be those affected by the problem. And they really should also be people who have resources. They should be people who can support the various aspects of what it means to organize a social movement. So identifying who those people are, identifying the various needs of the work that we're doing, and then working backward is a really good way to organize when you're an innovator. One of the big traps of innovation is blindness to negative consequences and what they call impractical elegance. So if we're not thinking about, I mean, one of the other technical terms for this is externality. So it's an unanticipated consequence of moving in a particular direction. Or if at first it was an unanticipated consequence and all of a sudden it's right in front of us, but we just kind of continue to ignore it and move forward anyway, it's going to start creating problems that we really don't want to deal with. Um, Let me see, I'm just going to refer to my notes here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the traps. As innovators are working to address the symptoms and the problems that they've identified, we may wind up reinforcing the roots of those problems and creating new symptoms. An example provided in this article is that people who have advocated charging user fees for health services in poor communities to avoid waste and increase revenue for supplies and repairs have actually found that even super small fees for healthcare services can actually significantly increase disparities in terms of access. So if you're charging poor people for healthcare, even at a what could be considered a low level, it may wind up creating a barrier. So figuring out how you can innovate around providing access without putting that cost burden onto the communities themselves is going to be the task at hand in this example. Like agitators, innovators must be forward-looking and keep orchestration in mind as they develop solutions. Without a solution that is feasible and capable of spreading throughout the sector that they're working in, the movement is at risk and may not move beyond the basic innovation itself. It's essential that innovators develop a well-defined theory of change that connects the inputs and activities involved in the proposed solution to its outputs and impact. So if you don't have a theory of change, that's a great starting point for anybody who's working more as an innovator in their community. That theory of change can look like, here's the problem, here's our approach, here's why we believe this approach is going to deliver the kinds of solutions that we all want to see. It's great when that can be backed up with data, but even if you're just getting started, having a theory of change that is logical and well thought out, developed, might be enough to get initial support and initial buy-in. And people who are in the private sector and they're trying to create some kind of a product or innovate in product development, they need to be able to have all of that stuff listed out before people would say, oh yeah, that's something I'm going to invest in, or that's something I'd buy, or that's something I'd give my money to. It's the same thing with social change and grassroots organizing. Innovators are often serving as bridges. So they have their own personal networks, their own personal sources of power, their own ideas. And typical fashion innovators too are kind of like multi-sector. They might be more of this like multi-potentialite kind of a person rather than a super specialist. Innovators are really good at taking seemingly disparate ideas and connecting them together to create something new. The creativity and the innovation really comes out of those dots being connected that really maybe haven't been connected before, or connecting them in new ways. And yeah, another factor that should be considered is institutional constraints. So maybe your solution might exist in a more ideal sort of scenario, but if we're ignoring the institutional factors that are around us, like, maybe we're trying to solve a problem that is being regulated by a particular government agency, and they're the ones who have all of the access and resources and power and are the ones who are making all of these big decisions, then maybe we need to do more agitation than trying to innovate a parallel organization that's going to offer services differently. Understanding these institutional factors is actually super crucial to figuring out what the best approach is with respect to agitation, innovation, or orchestration. Okay. Any questions about that before we go on? Alrighty. So the third group that this article identifies is orchestration. So orchestrators are people who mobilize parties, different parties, around the solution and ensure its adoption. So a good example of that in the modern LGBTQ movement would be the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project has grown tremendously over the years from an organization that was just kind of a crisis hotline. It has now become among the largest LGBTQ advocacy organizations in the country. And they still maintain their services for LGBTQ youth and suicide prevention. But they've been able to bring so many different groups of people together around the same cause that they have become so much more influential and much more of a household name than they might have been before. And that, again, it comes back to communication. So getting clear on a message and tailoring it to different constituencies, different groups of people, while maintaining an overall coherence. So that coherence part is where things can start to go wrong. It actually leads us immediately into the trap. So orchestrators face really two primary challenges: mission drift and dilution. So as orchestrators are working to bring all these groups together and accommodate these different interests and develop some coherent strategy around how all these different parties are going to work together and be managed, there's a risk that the message can start to go like this. It can start to expand and become too big, and it really drifts further and further and further from that essential core of what initiated this movement in the first place. So making sure that the activities that they're planning and working with are actually serving the mission, the core mission, serving the theory of change. And they're not becoming increasingly bureaucratic. That's super crucial. Orchestrators also need to be careful not to dilute their message too much as they tailor it to the discourse of different people they want to persuade. So to avoid that, orchestrators need to develop and identify milestones and regularly assess their progress towards short and long-term goals. So when we identify these milestones and we have kind of an idea of maybe how long it should take in order to get there, if we find that we're super far off those targets or we're not addressing the problems at hand that we've identified from the beginning, we may need to reevaluate the effectiveness of our approach and make sure that there isn't mission drift that's happening. So let's see what else. This is good for orchestrators, or serving in an orchestration capacity is really good for people who are comfortable going to and speaking with people who are at the top of organizations. So connecting with influential players from different organizations, selling them on why this coalition that you're creating is important, it's valuable, why they need to be a part of it, what they'll get out of it, what they'll contribute to it, what the cost of this would be for them. Having those conversations can be a little intimidating at times. Like if you're kind of cold calling or sending a cold email out to the CEO of your local LGBTQ center and you've never met them before, and you're just trying to get a foot in the door and get a conversation started, you really have to believe in yourself and you have to believe in the effectiveness of this approach and what you're doing and why it's the right approach to the problem that you've addressed. And it also connects to teamwork and team building. A really good and highly effective social movement has a balance of agitators, innovators, and orchestrators. So people who are okay with communication across multiple groups, people who are forward thinking and developing solutions to problems, and people who are comfortable with stirring the pot, calling people out, raising awareness, investing in marketing. These are all pieces that when they come together, they can create something pretty powerful. There's a number of examples in this article that relate to situations in France where that happened. So developing a vision, identifying the problem, offering a solution, communicating the effectiveness of our approach, and bringing people together are really the secrets to effective grassroots organizing and social change. And for those of you who are watching this live streamed, I'm also going to put this article linked into the description of the video so you can explore it on your own time in greater depth. But we're going to take some time now to open it up for questions. You're welcome to turn your cameras on, but that's the overview of this article. So if anybody else too wants to talk about things that are unrelated to this, that would also relate to grassroots organizing, we can kind of take some time now to troubleshoot these problems together as a group. I tend to call this peer mentorship. So we're all sort of in it together, and maybe we have perspectives and advice for each other that might be helpful. So the floor is open. All right, if there aren't any questions, I'd love to hear some feedback. What role do you see yourself as more of compared to the others? Do you think you're more of an agitator? Do you think you're more of an innovator or more of an orchestrator?
I think,
Yep.
yeah, I think I'm gonna agree with what Zick and Jesse. I'd also consider myself an innovator.
Yeah, I'm also more of an innovator. So we've just got a whole room full of innovators right now. That brings us to our second topic, which is resource allocation. So from this framework of agitation, innovation, orchestration, that can also be an effective guide for us on how we are allocating our resources. So, for example, agitators might need resources that can help fuel public awareness campaigns, that can support funding for things like a podcast, for things like protest materials, for things like online advertising, branding. Coming up with a coherent brand around your message might be a great way to start getting people together on a common purpose around a common identity. Um, Orchestrators often need resources for building and maintaining networks, such as time for meetings, travel funds, developing virtual meeting spaces. Um, and innovators are oftentimes going to require resources for things like research and development, applying for grants to fund the solutions that they're working on, or even we can think of it in terms of we can think of resources in terms of human capital, such as access to experts who can offer advice, offer us perspective, take a look at some of the things that we've been developing. Maybe they have additional research that they can offer to us that we hadn't been exposed to before. That's frankly how I came into awareness of this article that I've shared with you all today, is through people in my life who I've turned to for support and for guidance. And so I'm wondering if anybody in the group wants to share, if you're working on a project or you've got some kind of a budget or some ideation that you're moving through around how you're going to create change in your community, where is your head at in terms of resource allocation right now? I'm sure we've all had these conversations with ourselves as, oh, I need more money to be able to do XYZ. What does that X, Y, and Z look like for you?
I can jump in here. I work for a nonprofit that provides creative programming for neurodivergent um, youth and young adults, and we've just launched a new program in 6 different locations around the state. And like my secret agenda, because we have one location that is led by 2 LGBTQ facilitators, and the primary, most of the folks who are the participants are LGBTQ as well. And so I guess my curiosity and resource allocation is looking forward, trying to develop some programs that are similar, that are specifically tailored for LGBTQIA folks, but holding the awareness that that can sometimes be a tougher sell to certain funders. So that's kind of where my head is at.
So let me make sure I understood. You have programs that you're creating for neurodivergent people. You've just opened up a bunch of new locations, and you're one of these groups is LGBTQ specific and facilitators and let's say clients as well. Um, and you're trying to think about funding, but you're also aware that certain funders might be wary about funding an LGBTQ specific group. Is that right?
Yeah, so it wasn't the intention to have one of these locations be LGBTQ specific. It's just sort of how it shook out. Um, and the grant overall is from the state of Wisconsin. And so I don't think that we could go back to like a state grant, or there are some limitations on the funding for participants who use Medicaid to right now the program is free, but in the future we might end up charging tuition for it. And so there are limitations that I didn't know about in the state for the wording around programs for folks on Medicaid, and like including LGBTQ specific language would sort of like send it to the bottom of the pile, so to speak, from what I've been told recently.
I see. So clarify again for me that were you saying you wanted more funding to tailor this experience more effectively to LGBTQ people specifically?
Yeah, so like the next iteration, right now it's a pilot program that's funded through the
Mm-hmm.
end of September. And so my personal goal, and I hope to be able to present it effectively to the rest of the organization so they feel that it's worthwhile, quote unquote worthwhile, is that like the second iteration of this program, instead of partnering with libraries, we could partner with local LGBTQ centers across the state, just because um, autism and other conditions are much less likely to be diagnosed in folks who are assigned female. And so there's like a very profound need there for that programming, in my opinion. So it's sort of like a ways out, but that I would love to be able to speak effectively and try to help attract funding for that specifically in the future.
Yeah, that makes sense. To me, it's sort of what's coming to mind is this notion around connecting your innovation to the problem and explaining why it's a superior solution. So, finding out how you can craft that message in a way that isn't going to send your application to the bottom of the pile, but also maybe doing some orchestration and finding out what other organizations or entities that are aligned with this common purpose of making sure that neurodivergent LGBTQ people are well supported and well resourced, who in that broader sector might be open and available to working with you or supporting this initiative. I'm sure you've already thought about these things, but it's an interesting situation when you're in a potentially hostile environment trying to innovate or trying to orchestrate how that can sometimes backfire or it can put more difficulties in your path than you would really ultimately want. But finding the creative solution, communicating it effectively, aligning yourself with some kind of a broader group, reaching out to people who have access to new resources, or maybe the funding that you're looking for from this one entity, if that doesn't pan out, the people that you're connected to could provide access to new avenues and alternative resources and sources of funding or expertise, um, that would help solve the problem that you're trying to solve. Yeah, does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Jesse says, I'm an intern at a local library. We were looking into we were looking at starting up an art program for the adult patrons. We have art supplies and access for the children and young adult floor, but we wanted to get something started for the 18 and over group as well. So I thought of asking local artists to come and host an event at designated times in which we could let our adult patrons use art to fulfill their time, but we don't have a budget for paying those artists to come. So a few weeks ago, we applied for a donation of art supplies from Blick Art Materials so that we could create an adult library cart for adults to use at their discretion. That sounds like a great project. So it sounds like your crux is really around getting funding for your project. Is that right? Yeah. So in that case, to me, it seems like your innovation column is pretty checked off. Like you've got a great idea for a program. You have fleshed out a good amount around that, and now you're just looking to bring funds in. So this, I think, is more of an orchestration thing also, where oftentimes we get, as innovators, and I'll speak from my experience too, as innovators, we can get really like, this idea is so good. It should just like people should just be throwing their money at it. Why aren't people throwing their money at it? This is crazy. So going from that to a strategic step-by-step process to engage potential funders, to identify the various groups of people who would benefit from something like this, who would want to participate in something like this, and figuring out how to monetize is crucial. So what you did in terms of trying to get a sponsor is awesome. That's a really great way to fund something like what you're trying to do. I'd say keep identifying prospects of companies that could offer art supplies and gather people around you as well. I know you said you're an intern at a local library, but maybe there are people in your personal network, or maybe there are other folks at the library who might want to dedicate some time to supporting your fundraising efforts. The best thing that you can do when you're orchestrating is to be really clear and make sure that if you're team building and you're bringing people together to support a common vision and goal, that they know what they're responsible for. They know how much time it's going to take approximately. The tasks that you're outlining and giving them are very specific and identified, and you'll wind up becoming more like a manager in that way than a doer. And it's a different kind of a role, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. But depending on how much free time you have, or how many contacts, or what your network looks like, it might be useful to expand that out and send a couple of emails to people who could align with your vision and help support you in making it a reality. If there's opportunities for companies like Blick to have their logo on things, or finding out what's important to them in terms of whether they just out of the goodness of their hearts want to give this, or whether they'd like some brand awareness. Those are some things that we get to think through when we're trying to fundraise. Yeah, awesome. Ever anything from you that you want to bring up?
Not particularly.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm happy to stay on for another 10 minutes or so if anybody wants to keep going or talk about anything. But I think we did a good job covering the agitation, innovation, orchestration. Review that chart that's inside of the article. If not, read the whole thing just to kind of give you some more of a framework around how you can be most effective in your role, and also do some team building where maybe you don't have the inclination or skills that are needed and called for, depending on what your project looks like. Um, and it would be much appreciated if you filled out that feedback form in the beginning of the chat. It should really only take like 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And thank you all for joining. Oh, you need permission. That's crazy, Tam. All right, hold on. I'll change that right now. Well, thank you for joining. And we're going to be doing another one of these in just a couple of months, so stay tuned. And best of luck. You're always welcome to reach out to us if you need anything. And if you'd like to share the Transformational Leadership Initiative application with anybody in your network who you think would be a good fit, we would love for you to do that. And yeah, I'm going to open up responses to the application right now, and it should be good to go. Or excuse me, to the feedback form. So hope everybody has a great rest of your day, great rest of your week, and look forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks, everybody.